going to be in Matthew chapter 24, which is in these Bibles on page 794. And Matthew 24 is a chapter that a lot of you have been coming up to me saying, I can't wait to see how you're going to handle Matthew 24 and 25. And I got to ask a question at the beginning of this thing. Why is everybody so interested in the end of the world? That's not a hypothetical. Like, seriously, why is everybody so interested in the end of the world? And it's not just now. People have been interested in it for kind of forever. A lot of you grew up with the book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which was all about how the Lord was coming back anytime. For me, that was my fad. Books were different. I grew up with the Left Behind series, and they were like New York Times bestsellers that were all about what it would be like if Jesus came back right now. And I grew up around people who thought that if you didn't believe that it was all going to happen exactly how those books said, well, they weren't even sure you were a Christian. Of course, it wasn't even just that the books were being sold. I had a friend when I was like 12. He was a Mormon kid, and we were heading towards Y2K, which for you younger folks, that was our slang for the year 2000, right? When it rolled over from one millennia to the next. And my Mormon friend was telling me how at their church, they were just really convinced that Jesus was coming back in the year 2000. And it wasn't just the Mormons. Lots of people thought he was coming back in Y2K. I remember December 31st, 1999. I was in the 15-passenger youth group bus on my way in between things. We had this area-wide youth group lock-in. We were in between locations when the clock went from 11:59 to midnight. It became January 1st, the year 2000, and we just kept driving. Nothing happened. Fast forward, maybe you remember 2012, the Mayan calendar, the year the Mayan calendar predicted the end of the world, right? It's not just Christianity that was worried about this. And so as a youth minister at that point, we didn't just throw an end of the year party. We got all of our youth groups together and we threw an end of the world party. And we partied all night. And then at midnight, guess what happened? All the parents came and picked up the teenagers and took them home. And we went to bed and got up the next day and did our thing. Wasn't the end of the world after all, was it? So it's not really all that surprising that when the pandemic hit in 2020, I got a lot of phone calls and had conversations with some of you saying, Aaron, do you think that this coronavirus, could it be a sign of the end times? The apocalypse is upon us. And it's fair to ask the question. It's common to ask the question. We're fascinated by the end of the world. Of course, my response was, as far as apocalypses go, the coronavirus was a pretty lame one. It's been bad, but compared to the Black Death or even the Spanish flu, it's been not that bad, but people were scared. It's not even just religions that are focused on the end of the world, right? I mean, Y2K was a secular apocalypse that they were worried about. And even now you can't turn on the internet or the TV without hearing about an environmental apocalypse or a nuclear apocalypse or a antibiotic-resistant bacteria apocalypse, or a manufactured virus apocalypse, or an economic apocalypse, whatever. We're just all sitting here convinced that it's all about to end, that it's going to come crashing down. Other religions are fascinated by the end of the world. The secular world is fascinated by the end of the world. And for Christians, every generation of Christians since Jesus have been convinced that their generation will be the one alive when Jesus returns. Every single generation for the last 2 millennia. Why are we so fascinated by the end of the world? Well, maybe Matthew 24 is part of the reason, actually. Let's read Matthew 24 together. As Jesus was leaving the temple grounds, his disciples pointed out to him the various temple buildings. But he responded, "Do you see all these buildings? I tell you the truth, they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives. His disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will signal your return and the end of the world?" Jesus told them, "Don't let anyone mislead you. For many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah.' They will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world, but all this is only the first of the birth pains, and with more to come. Then You will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You'll be hated all over the world because you're my followers, and many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and will deceive many people. Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And the good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world so that all nations will hear it, and then the end will come. The day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place. Reader, pay attention. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills. A person out on the deck of a roof must not go down into the house to pack. A person out in the field must not return even to get a coat. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for nursing mothers in those days. And pray that your flight will not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for there will be greater anguish than at any time since the world began, and it will never be so great again. In fact, unless that time of calamity is shortened, not a single person will survive, but it will be shortened for the sake of God's chosen ones. Then if anyone tells you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even God's chosen ones. See, I have warned you about this ahead of time. So if someone tells you, look, the Messiah is out in the desert, don't bother to go and look. Or, look, he's hiding here. Don't believe it. For as the lightning flashes in the east and shines to the west, so it will be when the Son of Man comes. Just as the gathering of vultures shows there is a carcass nearby, so these signs indicate that the end is near. Immediately after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then at last, the sign of the Son of Man is coming will appear in the heavens, and there will be deep mourning among all the people of earth. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with the mighty blast of a trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of the earth and heaven. Now, learn a lesson from the fig tree. When its branches bud and its leaves begin to sprout, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, you can know his return is very near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass from the scene until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will disappear, but my words will never disappear. However, no one knows the day or the hour when these things will happen, not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself. Only the Father knows. When the Son of Man returns, it will be like it was in Noah's day. In those days before the flood, the people were enjoying banquets and parties and weddings right up to the time Noah entered his boat. People didn't realize what was going to happen until the flood came and swept them all away. That is the way it will be when the Son of Man comes. 2 men will be working together in the field. One will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding flour at the mill. One will be taken, the other left. So you too must keep watch, for you don't know what day your Lord is coming. Understand this, if a homeowner knew exactly when a burglar was coming, he would keep watch and not permit his house to be broken into. You also must be ready all the time, for the Son of Man will come when least expected. A faithful, sensible servant is one to whom the master can give the responsibility of managing his other household servants and feeding them. If the master returns and finds that the servant has done a good job, there will be a reward. To tell you the truth, the master will put that servant in charge of all he owns. But what if the servant is evil and thinks, my master won't be back for a while, and he begins beating the other servants, partying and getting drunk? The master will return unannounced and unexpected, and he will cut the servant to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You can see why that's a challenging passage. What exactly is Jesus talking about? When exactly is Jesus talking about? And just about as many people as you'll ask, you'll get that many different answers. Whole books have been written about this. Whole denominations have been built on theology about passages like this one, and this one specifically. Thankfully, I'm here to set you straight in the next 20 minutes. No, if you're expecting me to explain all of this in a way that makes total sense, it's not going to happen. But perhaps it's not because there aren't answers. It's because if you're looking for a whole systematic theology about the end times, maybe we've missed the point of this. Here's what I am going to do this morning. This morning, I want to help you see this passage in a way that is deeply practical. If nothing else, it will be practical, because that's kind of the only thing that makes sense. If Jesus says this to his disciples and it's just about the end of the world, then how helpful is that for his disciples? It's been 2 millennia. Did he give them this answer so that you and I might be the ones to benefit from it 2,000 years later? Doesn't make a lot of sense, considering that all of his other teachings have been for these people. So there must be something else going on here. To be able to chip away at that, it's helpful for us to understand the structure of the Gospel of Matthew. So I've asked David Herrick, who I have talked to quite a bit about this and who will be teaching Bible class about this chapter later this morning, to kind of help set up the structure of Matthew to get us to a place where this passage begins to make a different kind of sense. David?
Hey, good morning, everyone. So I'd like to talk about Jesus, if that's all right with you guys. So we're going to go through Matthew, all 28 chapters, and we're going to do it in about 5 minutes, because that's how much time Aaron gave me. Unbeknownst to him, I'll probably take somewhere on the order of 7 or so. Matthew was an accountant, and he became, after meeting Jesus, a master teacher. And so when he presents Jesus to us, he's doing it as a teacher. And so he gives it to us in 5 lessons. So when Matthew originally wrote his gospel, there weren't any chapters, there weren't any verses in there, so he didn't structure it that way. That was something that scribes put in later on. Instead, Matthew shows these 5 speeches that Jesus gives, and those are our 5 lessons. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick look at each of those 5 segments. And at the end of each of those speeches that Jesus gives, there's this refrain that Matthew puts in. And every time, 5 times over and over, he says, "And after Jesus finished saying these things." All right. The other thing about these 5 lessons is they're not arbitrary lessons. They're actually progressive lessons. They move from one to the next. And they're designed to help you, as someone who has not yet seen the kingdom or not yet met Jesus, is going to actually be able to be introduced to Jesus and find out what he's like. And he's going to help you to build up and become better and better followers of Jesus until eventually you become disciples, and then you become master practitioners of the way of Jesus. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look through each of these 5 and we're going to see them, okay? So starting off, the very first section that you're going to find in Matthew is Matthew's chapter 1 through 7. And the issue here is, who is this Jesus? Who is this guy? I mean, is he just some guy coming in and teaching lessons? And Matthew spends 4 chapters proving to you over and over this phrase. Jesus did this in order to accomplish what was prophesied about the Messiah. He's proving to you that Jesus is the Messiah. That's the heaven-sent king. So, chapters 1 through 4, if you get nothing else, Jesus is a king sent from heaven. All right? So then that leads us into chapters 5, 6, and 7, where Jesus gets to give a speech. And this is the kind of speech that you would expect from a new king. And he gives what would effectively be an inaugural speech, a constitution. So for you who are entering into the kingdom and you want to know what his kingdom's like, chapters 5, 6, and 7, that's our constitution in this kingdom. As citizens of this kingdom, that's where we are. And so you need to know that Jesus is the king in order for the speech in 5, 6, and 7 to make sense. All right, so that lays the foundation for our kingdom. What happens at the end of this? Well, you just have Jesus. He's one guy just spouting some ideas. In order for it to become a kingdom, it's got to grow. And so that's the next section in Matthew, is chapters 8, 9, and 10. You see growth. 8 and 9, you see, again, stories, and then a big speech by Jesus in chapter 10. And in chapter 10, that's when he sends out the disciples, and he says, go and tell your fellow countrymen that the kingdom of heaven is here. And that's where you see people start to come in. But right before that, it deals with this question. How does the kingdom grow, and what are its limits? Is Jesus to be the king of just one hill? Is he the king of a county? Is he the king of a small state, a nation state? Is he the king of a continent? What are his limits? If he's not going to be the king of Scandinavia, we don't go to Scandinavia. But if he is a king who has no limits, then we go everywhere. And one of the verses that I want to highlight in the middle of this, as they're trying to figure out, hey, how much power does this guy actually have? How much authority does he really have? The disciples are in awe as he calms the storm. And their phrase is, who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? You need to understand, when it comes to Jesus and his kingdom, there are no limits. He's the king of everywhere and everything. All right, so now that we get a sense of how this kingdom is going to grow and what its limitations are going to be, which is everywhere, we're going to have some pushback, because as something grows, you're going to get people who are going to resist that growth. And so after chapter 10, starting in chapter 11 and 12, you get these stories of pushback as Pharisees come and they challenge. Now, some of that pushback is good. The critical thinkers are going to be right here. They're going to be saying, hey, what's going on? The ones who are just kind of on the edge. And so you've got your early adopters, you've got people who are not quite yet sold, and you've got people who are definitely resisting the kingdom. All three groups have gathered together for this third speech that Jesus gives. And this third speech is the linchpin of the entirety of the book of Matthew. And so I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to skip it for now. In the fourth section, starting with chapter 14, Jesus approaches his disciples, and you get a sense in this fourth section of what it means to be a disciple inside of his kingdom. And I got to warn you here, as people who claim the identity of Christ and are wanting to follow him, I have to warn you, this section opens with John the Baptist, one of Jesus' followers, being beheaded. He is killed because he follows Jesus. And I want to warn you that as a Christ follower, that is very much on the table. If you choose to be baptized and you choose to follow Christ, that's on the table. It's not guaranteed. It's not necessarily where it's going to lead you, but that's on the table. I want you to know that. After that, you see a series of stories of Peter as kind of the quintessential disciple, and he keeps stepping out, and he keeps failing, and he keeps trying over and over, because that's kind of the pattern as we're following Jesus, is that we're going to keep trying, and every day we have to get up and keep reminding ourselves, and we keep trying, because everything we learned before that is different than the way of Jesus. So once we've become followers of Jesus, then this final section that culminates in the speech in Matthew's chapter 23, 24, and 25. This is a speech, and this is a section that is for you who are leaders, who are influencers, you Christians who have someone who is following you and watching you and wondering, hey, what's going on? Whether you're a mother of 2 children or you're a teacher, you have some kind of influence, and that makes you a leader. So for you who are leaders in the kingdom, what does leadership in this kingdom look like? And that's where Matthew chapter 23, 24, and 25, they all deal with that issue. And so I'm going to dive into those. But first, I'm going to jump back to Matthew 13. That was that third one. And the reason why I held that one just a little bit is because that's the point of Matthew. One of the things you need to understand about Middle Eastern culture is that they teach things just a little bit differently. We like to have a speech where we say, hey, here's what I'm going to do, and then I prove it, and then I summarize it at the ending. That's not how the Middle Eastern thought process is. Instead, they like to go like it's a journey. We're going to go from home to grandma's house and back. And that's kind of the structure that they like to do for their lesson. If I get to grandma's house, that's not the end. That's just the middle. And I want you to say the word middle with me, would you? Middle? Middle. See, that's the key to understanding how Middle Easterners like to present their information. It's in the middle, because that's where you're going to go. On the way to grandma's house, we're going to talk about what we're expecting to do when we go to grandma's. Then we go and we have our time with grandma. And then on the drive back, then we talk about what just happened. And that's how they present their information. And so in Matthew, he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 speeches. So let's look at that third speech. And it lines up in the same type of way. It's a speech about what the kingdom is like. He gives parables, lesson after lesson about what that kingdom's like. And right in the middle of that speech, Matthew includes a very odd detail. See, before that, he's out on the hillside, and he's with his disciples. But then right in the middle, he transitions, and he takes his disciples into the house. And it's at that point that Matthew is inviting you as an audience, please, just like Jesus brought the disciples into the house, please come into the kingdom. Everything prior to that, he's been addressing you as outsiders. He's showing you what the kingdom's like from an outside perspective. From that point on, it's an insider perspective, and he's asking you, come, be a member so that you can learn what discipleship is like. That's that next section. And then once you're a disciple, then learn what it's like to be a leader. And he needs you to be a leader because he knows that he is going away. He's going away, and so he's going to leave the leadership of his kingdom in your hands. So he needs to train you up. So let's look at that section, because that's Matthew 23, 24, and 25. Now, Aaron already talked a little bit about Matthew 23 last week, when Jesus was going toe-to-toe with the Pharisees. The reason why he's picking on the Pharisees is because that's your model of what the leadership was like for them. That's what his disciples would have defaulted into if it weren't for Jesus. They would have led the world just like the Pharisees did, with religious hypocrisy, with adherence to law and rules such that there was no sense of mercy, with entitlement, looking for comfort. Those are hallmarks of how the world likes to lead. And Jesus calls them out on it in chapter 23. In Matthew 25, instead, he portrays leadership in a whole different way. He shows a servant-based leadership, one where you see the needs of your fellow man and fellow woman, and you meet their needs. At the tail end of 25, you see this discussion between Jesus and his disciples, and they're wondering, hey, when was it that we were serving you? And Jesus says, it was when you did this to the least of these. That is what he's calling you to as leaders. It's to pay attention to those who are hungry, feed them. Those who are sick, heal them. Those who have no home, give them shelter. You understand what I'm saying? Those who have no education, teach them. That's what he calls you to. Those who are needy, clothe them. That's what leadership in his kingdom is like. It is paying attention to the needy. Let that be the mission of our church. Let that be what our reputation is as a church. Not this religious hypocrisy, not the sense of we're going to follow these rules and have no sense of mercy. No. He is calling us desperately into the content of Matthew 25, and he's saying, don't be like Matthew 23, be like 25. And then here in, again, the middle, Matthew 24, he's going to fast forward just a little bit, and he's going to show us how both of these two wind down, these two different leadership models. In 23, you've got the leadership model of the world, and so the top half of 24 deals with how does that wind down, and you will see some of the most awful, cataclysmic language that Jesus describes one of the history's worst events ever. Because when it comes to human beings leading, we oppress each other to the point that we are just awful to each other. And that's the warning, is that if you follow that model of leadership in 23, the top half of 24 is how it's going to all end for you. On the other hand, if you follow that leadership pattern in Matthew 25, where you heal the sick, and you feed the hungry, and you clothe the needy, then the back half of 25, how is it going to end? When is it going to end? Nobody knows, because it could go on forever. Nobody knows the hour exactly when he's going to come back. But when he does come back, it's not going to be that downward spiral that the world is going to offer of just pure destruction. Instead, it will be the final joining of heaven and earth as they finally come together. And that's the back half of Matthew 24. And so Jesus is imploring you. He's commanding his disciples, but I beg you, please, as a friend, don't follow that world's pattern of influence where we oppress each other. Instead, be about meeting the needs of your fellow man. Please, let that be what you're about. Let that be what this church is about. I'm begging you. Thanks.
All right. So Matthew, in his gospel, is using this discourse from Jesus to encourage his church to live faithfully while they await Jesus' return. It's important to see that right at the beginning of this chapter, his disciples ask him a couple of questions. Look again, when they're on the Mount of Olives in verse 3. His disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will signal your return and the end of the world?" Depending on how you read the Greek text, there are either two or possibly even three different questions here. The first question is, when will all this happen? The destruction of the temple, that not even one stone will be left on another. And then there are one or maybe two other questions, which is, what will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign for the end of the age? Now, David is actually going to do a deep dive into this chapter during Bible class, and you're going to have a chance to ask tons of questions. I hope you'll join him in FLC 1. What I want to do is give you a practical approach that we can all use without having to do a deep dive into word studies and that kind of stuff, okay? So, for the sake of the sermon, part of what David can tell you about, and part of what you need to know is that Jesus here partially is predicting the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So prior to that, about 30 years after Jesus died, the Jews revolted once again against the Roman Empire and killed a bunch of Roman soldiers, ran them out of town, and when Rome finally came back and retook Jerusalem, they leveled the temple. But before they did that, they actually offered pagan sacrifices to pagan gods on the altar of the Jewish God. It's a way of saying our gods are much more powerful than yours. So this is the abomination that causes desecration. That happened when they destroyed the temple. And then they spent months tearing the temple apart stone by stone. In fact, the destruction of Jerusalem was so complete that it actually lowered the Temple Mount by a couple hundred feet. Part of what Jesus is telling his disciples here is be ready for that event. He's keeping them safe. But wait, you might be thinking, I thought this was about the end of the world. After all, there's all this stuff about the world ending, seeing Jesus in the clouds and a loud trumpet blast and the sky is darkened and the stars will fall. Like you're telling me that if this is all about AD 70, then none of that happened before AD 70. I thought this was about the apocalypse. That's a great question. The apocalypse is a common theme, not just in the gospel, but in the entire Bible, the Old Testament and the New. In fact, it starts in the prophets and it worked its way all the way through the book of Revelation, the very last book of your Bible. The Bible Project did an excellent video about apocalyptic literature. It helps you understand what exactly is going on, and it's going to help us better understand what Jesus is doing here. So let's watch this video together.
It's the end of the world. The moon turns to blood, mountains crumble, mutant locusts swarm. These are just some of the strange images we find in parts of the Bible called apocalyptic.
And while most people think the biblical word apocalypse means the end of the world, it actually doesn't mean that at all.
So let's talk about how to read apocalyptic literature in the Bible. So wait, the apocalypse doesn't mean the end of the world?
No. Apocalypse is a Greek word that means to uncover or reveal. An apocalypse is when you suddenly see the true nature of something that you couldn't see before.
Because I don't always see things the way they really are.
Right. We all develop familiar ways of seeing the world that can limit or blur our vision.
So an apocalypse is like a revelation.
Right. Now, in the Bible, an apocalypse is when God pulls back the curtain to show someone what's really going on in the world from a divine perspective.
For example,
take Isaiah the prophet. He's suddenly transported in a vision into God's throne room.
Oh, right, he's in God's temple, described as a bridge between heaven and earth.
And there, God gives him a divine perspective on Israel's past, present, and their future.
So that Isaiah can bring challenge and comfort to God's people in his own day.
Or think about the Apostle Paul, who was trying to stop the movement of Jesus, but then he gets stopped in his tracks by a vision of the risen Jesus himself.
Yeah, he realizes that he's fighting against the very thing that he's been hoping for, and it changes the course of his life.
So these apocalypses give people a heavenly perspective on their earthly situation, and they can give hope, or they can challenge you.
Or make you change everything.
Now, those are biblical stories about people having an apocalypse. There are also whole sections of biblical books where a prophet describes extended apocalyptic dreams and visions. People call this apocalyptic literature.
And reading these dreams and visions is difficult. I mean, they're filled with strange images. Like, let's take Daniel. He sees ferocious beasts coming up out of a dark sea, trampling people on the land. And then a character called the Son of Man is exalted to rule the world. What is going on?
Yeah, apocalyptic literature is written in a poetic, imaginative style, and it's packed with symbolism.
How can I know what these symbols mean?
Well, first, by studying the rest of your Bible. Apocalyptic imagery is based on biblical design patterns that begin in the book of Genesis and then develop throughout the Bible. like the chaotic sea in the first sentences of the Bible that God tames but doesn't eliminate as he orders creation. And so the sea becomes an image of danger, death, and cosmic chaos.
And the dry land, which comes out of the sea, is the safe, ordered place where humans are supposed to rule as God's image.
Yes, and also on the land are beasts that humans are supposed to oversee. But keep reading, and the humans are deceived by a beast.
And start acting like violent beasts.
Exactly. Now, sometimes a prophet will tell you what a symbol means. Like in Daniel, we're told those beasts symbolize violent human kingdoms. But more often, the authors just assume you know how to trace an image through the biblical story to understand its meaning.
Now let's look at the last book of the Bible, the Revelation, because it's one really long vision. The whole thing is an apocalypse.
Yeah, and it works the same way. It begins with John the visionary transported to God's throne room, where he sees the risen Jesus as the exalted king of the world.
But Jesus is depicted as a bloody lamb.
Right. It's a design pattern showing how Jesus is the sacrificial lamb from Israel's Passover and from the Day of Atonement. He gave his life for the sins of the world. And then John sees the ultimate beastly dragon, that spiritual power that energizes violent earthly empires. It's cast out by Jesus, the world's true king.
Yeah. Now that reminds me, when I read the Revelation, I'm struck by all this cosmic destruction and violence. I mean, it happens over and over and over.
Yeah, in the Revelation, there are 3 7-part cycles of God's judgment, and it's another design pattern that connects together the stories of the flood, the 10 plagues on Egypt, and the exile to Babylon, and even more. These are moments when humans unleash so much violence and death into the world that God hands them over to self-destruction. It's like a reversal of creation in Genesis chapter 1, as God allows the world and humans to sink back into darkness and disorder.
That's sobering.
It is. But remember, in Genesis 1, God overcame darkness and chaos with his light and life. And so too in the Revelation. The death of Jesus and the death of the world as we know it is the pathway into the renewed creation that began with the resurrection of Jesus.
And so while the Revelation feels like the end of the world,
it's actually about the beginning of the renewed world, where heaven and earth are reunited and God's human images rule all creation in the love and power of God.
Okay, this is a lot to take in.
It is. And there's a lot in these books that is still hard to understand, but the purpose of Apocalyptic is really clear: to give us a heavenly perspective on our earthly circumstances so that every generation of God's people can be challenged, comforted, and given hope for the future.
So apocalyptic literature is a common style in the Bible. It's a special revelation that something big is about to happen. And there were lots of apocalypses. There were apocalypses with Israel and Judah when they were taken into captivity and when the temple was destroyed. There was apocalypses when the Babylonian and Persian empires fell. There was an apocalypse when the second temple was desecrated by the Greeks before the Romans did it. This was during the time of the Maccabees before Jesus. And so here, when Jesus uses this apocalyptic language, his disciples know that he's teaching in that vein. In fact, Jesus is even pulling directly from some of the passages that they would expect to hear when using apocalyptic language. Rather than predicting the end of the world, Jesus is using Old Testament passages to explain that the temple will be destroyed, and then he uses the prophecy of David to apply it to his own death, burial, and resurrection. This is the Son of Man coming in the clouds. It's straight out of the book of Daniel. One of the things that gets us stuck here is this idea that we're talking about the end of the world, but Jesus actually uses the phrase, the end of the age. It describes the ending of one system or order and the beginning of something new. And it's always violent and painful upheaval for those who are caught in it. Now, Jesus is telling his disciples that a new, painful, violent upheaval, this end of an age, is coming. First to Jerusalem, but then they're also going to be affected by it because because there's also a wrestling match going on, not just between the Jews and the Romans, but between this old world order and this new kingdom of God. And so Jesus, when he uses this apocalyptic language, he's telling his disciples that the old age, the old thing is passing away, and now it's going to be violently opposed by the people who have a stake in it, by the people who don't want to see it go away. But if these moments of upheaval are always violent, Jesus flips the script here. Because for Jesus, it's not that his people will do violence to the established world order. It's that the established world order will do violence to Jesus, but he will allow them to do so. And in his death, burial, and ultimate resurrection will be planted the seeds of the new order that will last forever, the very reign of God. That doesn't mean there won't still be violence, you see. He says there will still be wars and rumors of wars, and you'll be persecuted and put to death. Like, there will still be violence, but the new kingdom that will last forever is not a kingdom that behaves that way. It's a kingdom that suffers and serves and loves people, even when they persecute you. Okay, so does Jesus not predict the end of the world? Honestly, I don't know. David's going to talk more about that in Bible class this morning. But for now, I want to give you a mental model that I have used that's helped me move past getting worked up about when will the end of the world be, or is this the end of the world, okay? Here's kind of the way that I run through it. First, creation is good. God is committed to it, and we are created to enjoy it. It's okay to enjoy life. Part of the challenge of always waiting for the apocalypse is the assumption that what is here and now isn't already good. But the Bible teaches us God's creation is very good. It's okay to enjoy it. Second, everyone thinks they're going to be the last generation on earth. If you had to guess, are you going to be alive when Jesus comes back? Statistically, it seems pretty unlikely. You got 2,000 years worth of people saying yes who have all been wrong. So it seems unlikely that it would be you or I. So creation is good. We're meant to enjoy it, and everyone has thought they were going to be the last ones. None of them were, so probably we won't be either. Then this may be my favorite part. When I was a kid, I would ask my dad about this question. Well, is the world going to end? How's the world going to end? Is there going to be a rapture or not? Great trumpet blast, fire? What happens? My dad said, well, I don't really know. However it happens, my dad would say, however the end of the world comes, whether it's my death or Jesus comes back, I want to be on the first train out. Ha! I love that. And then either way, our duty and our opportunity is to live faithfully, enjoying God's creation and helping spread the kingdom of God to others. Once I settled on that way of thinking, it kind of makes the rest of the concerns evaporate. Why worry about it? There's good things to enjoy and good work to do. Now, to be fair, I probably won't write any Christian best-selling books with that kind of a system, but you know what? I live at peace, and hope you can too. We're going to look more next week at exactly what a Christian's responsibility is during these times of upheaval. But for now, I hope we will embody these words of Jesus from verses 45 and 46, where Jesus said, "A faithful, sensible servant is one to whom the master can give the responsibility of managing his other household servants and feeding them. If the master returns and finds that the servant